All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our urban conservation portion of our Land Managers Toolbox webinar and workshop series. Today's webinar, we're going to be covering urban habitat and be presented by myself. I'm Jessica Cox, not Ryan Diener, that's my boss. His name is on the Zoom account. I'm a Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist in Fort Smith. Just a heads up, we will be opening registration for our in-person field tours tomorrow. So as you can see on your screen, we have our webinars listed that we have already had and the one we're having today. And then our field tours are going to be next week, Wednesday, February 23rd. We're going to be having one here in Fort Smith at the Ben Guerin Golf Course. That will be led by myself and Jay Randolph. That's going to be from 10 to 12. And then also we're going to be having another one in Bentonville, Arkansas, from 10 to 12 at the Compton Gardens and Arboretum. That's going to be an urban habitat field tour led by our Farm Bill biologist in that area, Katrina Sims. Again, those registration links for both of those events can be found on our Quail Forever in Arkansas Facebook page, and registration will open for both of those events tomorrow. We created 2 events just to try to reach out to more people. So if you're in either of those areas, please feel free to register for those. Again, a couple housekeeping things before we begin. These webinars are being recorded and they are being posted to our Quail Forever in Arkansas YouTube page. Once those have been posted, all registrants will receive a link to those webinars. We'll also, at the end, we're going to have kind of a short Q&A session, but I encourage you to type any questions that you have as we go into the chat box, and we will get to those questions at the end of the presentation. So all right. And it's not moving forward. Okay. Sorry about that, having some technical difficulty getting the presentation to proceed forward. There, well, no, way back. Is it doing anything on your end, Katrina?
Yes, I can see a map.
Okay, it's not moving from there. That's
No.
Way down in the
Well, so far it's still on the map of Egypt. And
okay, let me try stop sharing real quick. Let me try resharing my screen. No, okay. Sorry about this, folks. Let me try this one more time. May have to close out my PowerPoint and reopen it. Yeah. You get on? Okay. Okay. Katrina, can you see the presentation?
Yes, I can see the introduction slide.
Okay. Let's see if it will let me move through. Aha! Did it move through on your end?
Yep, it's on urban habitat now.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that, folks. Looks like we can get started now. So again, today's webinar is going to be on urban habitat. My name is Jessica Cox. I'm a Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist in Fort Smith, and I cover Sebastian, Scott, Franklin, Logan, and Yell counties, so kind of the west central part of the state. So before we begin, I'd just like to go over our mission here at Quail Forever and kind of who we are and what we do. So our mission is to conserve quail, pheasants, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, education, and conservation advocacy. As you can see, I have habitat improvements and education in bold because as a biologist, these are the two parts of our mission that I have the most direct involvement with. And there are several ways that we work to achieve these mission goals and objectives. Two of the biggest ways that we work to achieve these are through native habitat restoration and also public education and outreach. So that native habitat restoration can be in the form of grassland or forest land restoration. Pollinator habitat restoration is what is our main focus on today with our urban habitat. And also managing for native inclusive and wildlife friendly working lands, whether that be cattle and livestock operations, row crop and agricultural lands, or timber operations. And on the other side of that is our public education and outreach. So we do a lot of workshops and landowner field tours, such as these webinars, just to promote what we're trying to do. We provide technical assistance for landowners in the form of site visits and wildlife management plans. We also work closely with our Quail Forever chapters across the state to help generate awareness and funding for habitat restoration projects. And then we also assist other conservation organizations with data collection and monitoring efforts for both native vegetation and wildlife populations. So now that you have a little bit better understanding of who we are and really what we're trying to accomplish, let's jump into our discussion on urban habitat. So a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing today is what is urban habitat, the importance of urban habitat, some issues that come up when dealing with urban habitat, creating urban habitat, and then some resources that are available for landowners. So again, what is urban habitat? So cities and urban landscapes are definitely not a new phenomenon. The earliest cities, as you can see in this map, can be traced back to Mesopotamia, which is like present-day Iraq, Egypt, India, and China. We've all probably heard about these early civilizations at some point or time in a history class. And all these civilizations have been around for thousands of years. Today in Arkansas specifically, the bigger urban areas and cities that we're looking at are going to be Little Rock, the Fayetteville or Northwest Arkansas area, and Fort Smith. These urban areas are often at the center of both economic and technological advancements, and they also provide a lot of resources for our growing population. So that's why a lot of people are drawn to these urban areas and why they're expanding, because of this access to kind of confined resources. So a large number of resources within a relatively small area. However, while these advancements have allowed for this significant growth, there are also several downsides that are associated with this kind of urban sprawl that we're seeing. And of these, wildlife habitat has been significantly affected by urbanization, which is just the process of making an area more urban. So as cities and towns spread into undeveloped areas, habitat for many species has been destroyed or really altered to the point where it's virtually useless. So for example, in a city, if you have a large vacant lot in the middle of an urban area, you know, that site has potential for wildlife habitat, but if it's not being managed or it doesn't have those resources available, then it's virtually useless for any wildlife that potentially could use it or once used it in the past. However, with all of that being said, there is still great potential within our urban areas to create sustainable wildlife habitat. And that sustainable is key when developing habitat. So we don't only want to provide resources for those species that are there now, or even those individuals that are there now, but we really want to provide resources to allow for those populations to grow and really thrive in our urban areas. So some examples of potential urban habitat sites include our yards and gardens. So that's one of the most obvious ones and ones where people may be able to have more of an impact. But there's also parks and cemeteries, those vacant lots we were talking about, campus areas, either with public schools or at universities, golf courses. So if you tuned into our webinar a couple of weeks ago, we heard from Jay Randolph, who's the golf course superintendent here at the Ben Guerin Golf Course. And this is a picture of some of the habitat work that they've been doing there. So they've managed to restore a lot of acres of native habitat in these unused areas of the golf courses. That webinar will be posted to our YouTube page. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend you go back and watch that webinar. But there's also airports, landfills, roadsides, and right-of-ways. And the list goes on and on for these small areas within our urban settings that can be used for potential habitat. While our cities and towns may not ever be able to support the wildlife diversity that was once in these areas prior to urbanization, there are still many species that can benefit from them. I know when I look outside my window or out in my backyard, and I live in Fort Smith, which is the third largest city in the state, I still see a lot of wildlife. I see birds, squirrels, rabbits, tons of insects and butterflies and bees. So even the most urban areas are not devoid of wildlife, which is why it's so important for us to manage for habitat even in the most urban settings. So, and that kind of brings us to why is urban habitat important? So if we look at this slide, we can see a picture of the state of Arkansas, and I'm sorry if it's a little blurry, but Arkansas has about 137,732 square kilometers of land. Of that, about 2,331 square kilometers is considered urban. So if you look at this map of Arkansas, that kind of mustardy yellow color are areas that are considered urban within Arkansas. And those biggest points are going to be, in central Arkansas, you've got Little Rock, then you've got Northwest Arkansas, which is going to be your Fayetteville area, Springdale, Rogers, Bentonville. Moving a little south into more West Central, you've got the Fort Smith area, and then over in Northeast Arkansas is Jonesboro. So those are some of our bigger urban areas. So of that 2,331 square kilometers being considered urban, that's about 1.7% of the total land area, according to the USDA Forest Service, which is where this information came from. So while 1.7% doesn't really sound like much, if you start really looking at it, that equates to over 500,000 acres of urban area within the state. And so while not all of this area, because it is urban, so you have infrastructure, you have buildings in these urban areas. So not all of those acres are going to be able to be turned into habitat or used for habitat, but that's still a significant amount of habitat potential in these areas. So Doug Tallamy said it really well. If half of American lawns are replaced with native plants, we would create the equivalent of a 20 million acre national park, 9 times bigger than Yellowstone or 100 times bigger than the Shenandoah National Park. So again, this is not Arkansas, but this is talking about, the United States as a whole. But this just shows you that the amount of urban habitat potential around the United States is great. And while most of Arkansas is considered rural, there is still a lot of potential for creating good habitat. And I've said it and I'll keep saying it again, that no amount of space is too small to do habitat work on. These small acres do add up and can create a significant impact, more than what most people realize. So if you're like the many people that think they can't make a difference because they don't have hundreds of acres, stop, because there's still a lot of work that you can do and a lot of quality habitat that can be implemented on even the smallest of acres. So what are some of the benefits of urban habitat? So those benefits are numerous. Providing resources for wildlife and pollinators is, most people's #1 priority when developing urban habitat or backyard habitat. Providing that forage, nesting, and overwintering sites, and also reducing the effects of habitat fragmentation. But developing urban habitat can also save money and time for you and city employees. So one example would be by mowing and fertilizer costs are decreased by establishing native grasses and native wildflowers in areas that are currently in, non-natives like Bermuda or fescue that have to be constantly mowed and have fertilizer applied to them to maintain them. By developing those into native plants, we can reduce those costs and times associated with managing those sites. Water quality and soil health benefits. So we see increased water filtration in areas where native plants are being established. We see reduced erosion and also an increase in carbon sequestration. And in addition, they also provide great education outreach opportunities for people. So these sites and having sites like this where we can take people out and show them what our native vegetation looks like and show them even some of our native wildlife species is really a great tool. We're able to reach a much broader audience in these urban settings because there's more people to reach out to. So now let's go over some common issues with urban habitat. And I really like this picture. This is a picture that I took at the Ben Guerin Golf Course, and Jay Randolph in his presentation goes over this, what I'm fixing to talk about in a little bit more detail. But this field right here was the first field planted in like pasture grasses that were not introduced, and he's gone in and he's converted it back into natives, and it's just really cool to see that conversion back into natives and all the wildlife that benefits from it. But some common issues we see with developing urban habitat. The first thing is a loss of native diversity. So many times we see invasive ornamentals and non-native species brought in either for aesthetic purposes, or sometimes they're even brought in for water quality or erosion control. But turf grasses, Bermuda and fescue being lawn grasses, we've seen these monocultured grasses, as you can see in the picture. It's just pretty much there's no flowers there. It's all clean cut. There's really no habitat to be seen in yards like this. And a lot of these invasive ornamentals, the showy flowers, trees, and shrubs that are brought in because they look pretty, but they really don't provide any wildlife habitat or any use at all for our wildlife. Fragmentation is another thing that we see with urban habitat, and we see fragmentation all across the state, whether it's urban or rural land, but the effects of fragmentation in urban settings is really great because we have these large areas of unusable space, and it's not just that they're not being managed, but they really are unusable because they're covered with buildings or streets. So you couldn't really develop habitat on them even if you wanted to. And these areas really restrict or prevent the movement of our wildlife between areas where there is habitat present. So that can create a problem, and we really have to take that into consideration when we're planning our urban habitat. Some other issues we run into are city codes and ordinances. So oftentimes cities and towns will have restrictions on how tall your grass can be, on tree and shrub maintenance. Those lawns have to be kept up to code or you could receive fines. And these all vary depending on city and location. But I pulled this information from the city of Fort Smith's page. So for example, There are restrictions on overgrown lots and yards, saying that all grasses and weeds shall be maintained at 10 inches or less in height, which I think for a city, 10 inches is pretty generous. Other cities is much lower than that in height. And also, in regards to dead limbs and shrubby things, other things that could be used as potential habitat, we often see regulated with these city codes and ordinances. So when we're putting in habitat and building habitat in urban settings, we do have to keep these things in mind as well. And then that kind of goes into that urban lawn appeal. So again, these clean cut turf lawns, unmanaged areas are oftentimes seen as unappealing or unkempt. There's this weird shift that happened where everything went to having to be clean and to look nice. And with that came a loss of a lot of habitat. And we don't just see this happening in our urban areas, we see this happening on our pasture lands as well, with having everything brush hogged for basically no reason other than to keep it mowed down and looking nice. So that is another issue that we see when developing urban habitat. So now let's talk a little bit about what goes into creating urban habitat. So a couple of best management practices to keep in mind when you're developing urban habitators: to grow native, to have the diversity and availability for our wildlife, creating usable space, and then continuous management. So we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So growing native, that doesn't just mean growing native to the state. So when we're developing wildlife habitat, we really want to keep it ecoregion specific. So there may be plants that are native to Arkansas, but historically, they would only have been seen growing maybe in South Arkansas. So it's not something you would want to plant in the Ozarks or in Northern Arkansas, and vice versa. So we really want to make sure that the species that we put out on the landscape are specific to that ecoregion and to that site as well. So different plants have different requirements, whether that be water requirements or shade or sun requirements. So depending on your urban area, you want to make sure that the species that you're putting out there are going to do well and thrive. Many of our wildlife species have evolved and adapted with our native plant species. So we want to make sure, again, that those plant species are going to provide that maximum benefit for our wildlife. We want to avoid ornamental, non-native species. So a couple of common species that we see planted in urban areas are the Callery pears, which the Bradford pear is a cultivar that most people know of. Those were planted in a lot of urban areas. They're a big tree. They have the white flowers on them. They bloom very early, but they are highly invasive. So I know the city of Fayetteville, for example, has actually started a program where they will provide you at no charge a native tree to replace any Callery or Bradford pear tree that you remove. I know if you're driving from Fort Smith to Fayetteville along the interstate, you see these just lining the interstate. They are highly invasive and they offer little to no benefit for our native wildlife. English ivy is another common one that we see in urban settings, along with the Chinese wisteria, which is that purple. It has the really pretty purple flowers on it, and then privet. So privet was planted pretty much kind of like a fence. A lot of people use it as a shrub in their yards for a form of privacy, but again, it's highly invasive, very hard to control, and doesn't provide any benefit to our wildlife. So there are many other native options that are non-invasive that you can use in place of these non-native invasives. Another thing we want to look at when creating urban habitat is the diversity and availability. So always remember that the greater the plant diversity, the greater the wildlife diversity. A lot of our species, especially our pollinating species and our insect species, are specialists. So that means that they rely on a specific species of plant or maybe a specific family of plant for part or all of their life cycles. So making sure that we keep that in mind and we have those plants there, down at the bottom, you see that keep specialists in mind. So the most common one we talk about is going to be monarchs. So monarchs will only lay their eggs on milkweed species. So, Arkansas is lucky enough to have both a spring and fall migration of monarchs move through the state. So making sure that we have those milkweed species present in our urban areas is going to be critical so that those monarchs, as they migrate through, are able to have a place to lay their eggs. We also want to maximize bloom diversity. So having species that bloom early in the year, midway through the year, and then late in the year is critical, because that's going to provide that year-round forage for our wildlife. It's often kind of compare it to your refrigerator in your kitchen. You wouldn't want to just have your refrigerator stocked for one season. You wouldn't have any food throughout the rest of the year. I don't know about y'all, but I get hangry when I don't have food. So keeping that fridge full for our wildlife species, making sure that they have that year-round forage is critical with urban habitat, or any habitat for that. Then we want to look at usable space. So we have all of the habitat needs. Most common ones are going to be foraging needs, nesting needs, overwintering, and then escape cover and shelter. So we talked about habitat fragmentation a bit back in the presentation. And by ensuring that we have all of these habitat components within the same area, so in that usable space where it's usable, where they have access to it, is not going to completely get rid of the effects of habitat fragmentation, but it can help to mitigate some of those negative effects of habitat fragmentation. So we want to design our urban habitat with all of these needs in mind, so that we make sure that the wildlife that we have in our urban settings has everything that they need to complete all stages of their life cycle. And we also need to make sure that those components are laid out so that they are easily accessible. And then management. So management in urban settings looks a lot different than it does in our more rural settings. So in more rural settings, normally we're managing these sites with fire. In an urban setting, especially in a smaller backyard, that might not be as feasible. But some things that we do want to make sure that we're doing for these is controlling invasive and non-native species within our yards, or within these urban habitat areas, which in an urban setting can be a little bit more difficult because you are in such close proximity to other areas that are not being managed. So the chances are you're not having an entire community or neighborhood that's doing this. So really making sure that what other people have going on in their yards is not coming over into your yard and affecting your habitat is critical. So just keep an eye on what's going on out there, and make sure that we're removing those invasive and non-natives. Definitely keep areas clear of clutter and unnecessary, decorations. I know oftentimes we have the tendency to go out and really want to decorate our backyards, but we really want to make sure that we're keeping our wildlife in mind when designing these areas. And then if you are putting out artificial dwellings like bird boxes or bat boxes or bee boxes, that we're keeping those artificial dwellings and water sources clean. Again, because we are working in such small areas of land, these species don't have as much room to spread out, so they're in close proximity. So we do really have to worry about, them transmitting diseases and viruses and other pests between each other, since they are in a lot closer proximity to one another. Another thing we want to do is to minimize disturbances. So this can be a number of things, whether it's adjusting your mowing times or methods. So maybe not mowing that grass or, your yards as low as you normally do, leaving a little bit more height to your yard, or maybe, a lot of our bees, our native bee species, are ground nesters, and so the queens will spend the winter underground. And when they come out in the spring, they need access to forage pretty much immediately. So, that also tends to coincide right about when mowing season starts. So maybe, always keeping those city ordinances and stuff in mind, maybe look at pushing back those mowing times a little bit and giving those pollinators that are coming out of their overwintering sites time to get that forage that they need to get their energy built back up after spending all winter underground. Also leaving some undisturbed habitat sites. So, maybe if you have some piles of leaves or, a compost pile that you can leave out, that's going to create habitat for a number of insects. Maybe if you can have some shrubby cover out there. A lot of our pollinators will use the hollow stems of many native species of shrubs. I know elderberry is a great example of this. So those hollowed out stems can be used as nesting and overwintering sites for many species of pollinator. They also produce berries that our birds will eat, and they also provide for that kind of escape cover and shelter. You can also leave patches of unmowed areas, maybe block a little square off in your backyard and leave it unmowed so that those grasses can get a little bit taller and provide that habitat for wildlife. Talking about our pollinators and other insects, reducing or eliminating pesticide use is another way to minimize disturbances on those populations. So the most common one you've probably heard of is the neonicotinoids, which is a group of herbicides that's known to be harmful and fatal to most invertebrates. There was a lot of, years back, there was a lot about these neonicotinoids having dramatic impacts on our bee populations. So these neonicotinoids, they can be found in the pollen of a plant and the nectar of a plant. And so when the bees forage on these plants, they absorb these neonicotinoids, which can be fatal and even change the behavior of our bees. So we want to try to avoid pesticides at all costs. If they must be used, if you really just have to use a pesticide, just make sure that you use them deliberately and sparingly. And always take into consideration the fact that there are going to be other non-target species affected by the use of pesticides. But it's also important on that same note to realize that all species play a role in ecosystem dynamics. Predators within an ecosystem are a vital part of that ecosystem. You remember hearing back the wolves in Yellowstone. When we removed the wolves, that keystone species, it had very negative effects all the way down to water quality within that ecosystem. So we don't want to remove anything just because we might not like it as much. So it's important to have all of those, even those that may seem a little pesky. It's important that all of those species play their role within that ecosystem to maintain that balance. And then some other wildlife friendly practices that you can look at doing. A lot of places, if you don't have the room to grow or to put habitat out horizontally, vertical gardening or growing plants vertically along a wall or up a fence, that's becoming a very popular thing in a lot of urban areas. So that's always an option if you can plant some of those species that will be available for our pollinators vertically. That's a great option. You can also build shelters, so bird houses or bee boxes or bat boxes. I would caution on the bee boxes though, if you're purchasing commercial bee houses or bee boxes, just make sure that you're keeping those clean and sanitary. Most of our native bee species are actually solitary, unlike our honeybees that are very social. Most of ours are solitary, so they really don't prefer to be in such close proximity to one another. So just making sure that you keep that kind of stuff in mind whenever you're purchasing shelters or building your own shelters to put out for wildlife. And also putting out water. So our pollinators, our insects, and the birds will thank you. In Arkansas, we tend to get very hot summers and very dry summers. So, putting out water, but again, making sure that you keep those areas clean and sanitized is going to be key. So one of my favorite quotes from John Muir, putting this all together, packaging it up, takes a little bit of everything, but when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So you have to have all of these components together in order to create the final picture of what this habitat should look like. Again, so that usable space, but it's also going to take time, it's going to take resources, it's going to take dedication and education, and putting all of those together to really create these urban habitats that we need to expand on the acres that we're seeing put on our rural lands. And this is just a really quick, really cool little diagram for how to create habitat for those stem nesting bees. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of our native species of bees will actually use the hollow stems of native plants for overwintering and for nesting sites. So this is another practice that you can look at doing. So in the winter, you'll leave the dead flower stalks intact. And then in the spring, you'll actually cut those back, leaving a little bit of the stubble. And those hollow pits are where the female bees will lay their eggs. So they will lay their, and then in the summer, the new growth of that plant will come on, and the bee larva will be developing in those cut dead stems that are still present. And then in the fall and winter, you leave those dead tops on, and come in the spring, you cut those off. The eggs that were laid that previous spring will emerge as adults and will use the freshly cut stalks to lay their eggs. So if you have native plants in your urban area, I encourage you to do this just to create some more habitat for those stem nesting bees. And then real quick, some tips for buying seed mixes. So this is really important. A lot of people will tend to get on Amazon or get online to try to find a native seed mix to buy, because in these urban settings, unlike in our more rural settings, you're typically not buying acres and acres worth of seed to plant. So a lot of times people will jump on Amazon trying to find a native seed mix, and just be wary of any pollinator or butterfly mixes that you come across. Definitely read that label to see exactly what species are in the mix, and you want to go with the scientific name, because common names can get a little tricky. There are native plants and non-native plants that both have the same common name, so you really want to double check those scientific names to make sure that what you're actually putting out is native. And just because it says wildflowers doesn't mean they're wild or that they're native. So you might type in Arkansas native seed mix and it's going to pop up a bunch of seed mixes, but chances are most of those seed mixes are going to contain species that are not native to Arkansas or not native to the ecoregion or the site where you're wanting to plant them. And just be smart about what you buy. Do your research. Don't buy the first thing that pops up. Do a little bit of research before you spend your money. And then, as always, remember to go native and grow native. That is key when developing any wildlife habitat, whether urban or not, is to always plant native species. And one other thing that I want to point out while we're on the topic of planting native and, kind of being leery of planting things that aren't native, with our monarchs, a lot of people, we're planting those milkweed species here in Arkansas to support both those spring and fall migrations. But a lot of things we're seeing this tropical milkweed being planted. And yes, it's a milkweed species. Yes, our monarchs will utilize it to lay their eggs on. However, it's not recommended that you plant this species here in Arkansas because it's not native. It can also have other effects on monarchs. We're not going to go into all that during this presentation. I just really want to point out to make sure that you're putting out native milkweed. So the milkweed in this picture is called butterfly milkweed. You've probably seen this along roadways. It's got a really bright, vivid orange color, common along roadways or in old fields. There are several species of native milkweed to Arkansas, all of which are fantastic and I highly recommend that you make sure that you're planting that native milkweed. And just trying to stay away from this tropical milkweed in Arkansas. So now I'd like to go over some resources that are available to landowners or people who live in urban settings who are maybe looking to do some urban wildlife projects. So number one is your Farm Bill biologist. So like myself, Katrina Sims, she's also on this webinar. She's our Farm Bill biologist in the Harrison field office. We can help landowners utilize both federal and state cost share programs for high quality habitat for monarchs and pollinators. So, you know, there's various cost share assistance programs, but even if you're not going through a cost share program, we can still provide that free technical assistance. We write free management plans, whether that's forestry management plans, wildlife management plans. We do all of that free of charge. So no matter where you're at, we have Farm Bill biologists across the state. I'll show a map here in the next slide that shows where we're all at. But we can provide any assistance that you need. If it's just a question that you have, feel free to shoot us an email or give us a call, and we'd be more than happy to do that. Or if you have a site that you'd like us to come out and look and provide some recommendations, we'd be more than happy to do that as well. So that's a great resource. Again, here's the map of where the current Quail Forever Farm Bill biologists are. You can see this dark blue area is my coverage area, and then the purple up at the top is going to be Katrina. So for most people on this call, that's probably going to be the area you're in. But I also want to point out that there are private lands biologists with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission who can do the same thing, and they cover much more. They cover the entire state. So if you happen to be in an area where there's not a Quail Forever biologist, we could still help you out, or you could always reach out to that private lands biologist with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, and they should be able to assist you as well. So there's somebody in every county that can help you. The Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership is also a great resource. So they put out a ton of guides. They have an awesome website. It's arkansasmonarchs.org, where they have lists of native plant species and more information on pollinators and monarchs and our native bees. So they just have a plethora of information. So if you're looking for anything like that, I highly recommend that you check out their website and see those resources that they have available. The Missouri Prairie Foundation, which is grownative.org, is also a website that has an amazing amount of resources for landowners. So one thing that I really like about their website is that they have information on how to put these habitats together. So we talked about making sure that it's usable space. So they have information on designing these urban landscapes, which is really cool. So all the plans on their website will benefit pollinators regardless of the name of them. But again, that's grownative.org. It's the Missouri Prairie Foundation, another great resource for landowners if you're interested. Here's a couple books from Douglas Tallamy, who have that amazing quote about how much habitat we could have from urban areas across the United States. If you are a book nerd like me and you really enjoy reading, these are a couple of really great books from Mr. Tallamy that I would highly recommend that you check out. And then some other opportunities. So native seed collections, if you're interested in collecting seed for your project, there are different groups throughout the state. They're used in restoration projects. Just don't dig. So it is illegal to remove. So you can't just stop on the side of the road and start collecting seeds. Or dig up plants. I'm sorry, you can't just stop and start digging up plants. So these opportunities are there if you don't want to get online and buy a seed mix or purchase a seed mix, and you want to collect some seed that's native to your eco region. You can always reach out and find out information about these native seed collections going on across the state so that you can legally collect these seeds. There's also a public gardening funding through the Arkansas Native Plant Society. They must be used in public spaces. Funding amounts will vary and the deadlines depend on the amount requested. For more information on this project, you can visit the Arkansas Native Plant Society's website to find out more information. And then right here is just a list of websites for some of these people that I've mentioned, but others that I haven't across the state. So there's Quail Forever, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, the Natural Resources Conservation Service is another great technical and cost share provider for landowners. The Beaver Watershed Alliance, that's going to be more for Northwest Arkansas. The Watershed Conservation Resource Center. A lot of times these watershed conservation agencies will provide funding or technical assistance for landowners within certain watersheds to do habitat and native plant restoration. There's also the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension. They have on their website, they also have a ton of great articles that you can read covering pretty much any topic you can think of. That Arkansas monarch conservation that I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for some native species or more information on our monarchs and pollinators. Arkansas Department of Agriculture Forestry Division, maybe you live in an area where there's some forest sites within your urban areas, or the USDA Farm Service Agency also has valuable information for landowners looking to do some work on their properties. And then I'll kind of end with this quote. I was reading an article a while back and I found this and it really hit me, and I thought it would be great to include in this presentation on urban habitat. So it's any patch of land, no matter how small or how degraded, was once a site of myriad biological interaction. So converting a tiny urban lawn to native pollinator-friendly plantings can have rippling effects on the ecosystem as a whole. Even a salt marsh filled in with decades of garbage can again host migratory birds. While developed areas will only grow in size, forward-thinking designers can engineer ways for people to coexist with native species and reclaim unused, degraded sites for nature once more. Every parcel has promise, and each one of us can do our part to keep it. So that really hit me, that every parcel has a promise. So I've said it, and again, I'll say it again and again. No site is too small to do something on. These small acres do add up, and there is a vast, the potential for our urban areas, like I said, to increase and expound upon what we're doing in our more rural settings with wildlife habitat is just phenomenal. And I encourage each and every one of you, whether you have a backyard you're looking to do something in, or maybe you're wanting to get involved in your community to put in some more wildlife friendly areas in any of the sites that we mentioned, definitely do it. It's worth it. And there are resources out there that can help you get that done. So with that, we will go into our questions. My contact information is there in the box, as well as Katrina Sims, if you happen to be closer to her area. If you're not in either of our areas and you're kind of wondering who you should contact, still feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And with that, we will go, and if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. I'm not seeing any questions at this time. Or, I mean, in all honesty, there's not a whole lot of us on here. You can probably just unmute yourself if you have a question. Feel free to ask away.
Hi, Jessica, it's Ryan.
Hey, Ryan.
How easy is it for folks to plant their own, start their own native species from seed, if they were interested in doing that, and where could they look for seed at, and what advice would you give them for determining species to start on their own, for their own yards or along their sidewalks or backyards or whatever?
Right, yeah, that's a great question. So starting natives from seeds is not super difficult to do. At least in my experience, from what I've had experience with it, it's not hard to do. Again, when you're looking at what species that you're wanting to plant, you really want to look at your site conditions, where it's going to be. Are they going to stay in pots, or are you going to maybe try to transplant those seedlings into the ground? What kind of shade, what kind of sun is in those areas? What is the drainage like in that soil? There are vendors that sell either the seeds or the plugs that you can purchase them from. If you're interested, I have a list of native seed vendors. If you're interested in getting that information, please feel free to email me and I will send that to you. But there are quite a few seed vendors. There are some locally within Arkansas, or within, there's quite a few up in Missouri that can provide those seeds. But yeah, again, the Arkansas Monarch Conservation, their website has a list of native species, not just the list of them, but also the requirements for those species, and kind of how you need to take care of those, whether you're starting them from seeds or whether you're actually buying the plugs to plant in your yard. Okay, so we have Ryan, I hope that answered your question. We do have another question.
Absolutely. Yep,
okay.
Absolutely.
We do have another question in the chat box from Al. He said, I have Maximilian sunflowers in my flower bed that I transplanted in 2010. I think they are considered native. If I'm remembering correctly, and Ryan or Katrina, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe the Maximilian sunflower is not native to Arkansas. I think it has been naturalized to the state.
Yes, that is correct. So Maximilian sunflower is definitely native to prairie ecosystems, and we see it in Oklahoma and Kansas and even in states north and east of us. But for some reason, the historic range of Maximilian sunflower did not extend south into Arkansas and further south into places like Louisiana, to the best of my knowledge. But you know, it's still a great species. It's a great pollinator plant. It's not ecotype like Jessica talked about earlier. So there are some other varieties of sunflowers that are ecotype. To Arkansas, ashy sunflower is a great one. Sawtooth sunflower. There's several sunflower species ecotype that you can find for Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas. But you know, Maximilian is a great flower. But if you're looking for that ecotype sunflower, it wouldn't be a true native to Arkansas.
Right, yeah, and I do agree with you, Al. The bees do love them. I do see them oftentimes. I know several people that have Maximilian sunflowers planted in their yard, and yes, the bees do absolutely love them. And you know, I'm with Ryan. They're not, while they may not be, you know, necessarily native to this area, you know, they're not invasive. But again, like he said, just to reiterate, if you are wanting to stay with native, they're not technically considered a native. But we do find them a lot of times around here.
Jessica, this is Stephanie Lewis. Hi.
Yes.
May I make a suggestion
Yes.
for people who, if they want to take inventory of their area? I have an acre here in northern Pulaski County.
Okay.
And when I bought it, I started using Seek, the Seek app from iNaturalist, and it will give you at least the region, not the ecoregion, but the region like Southeast and what have you, of telling you what plant species you have. Yes. And that's how I've inventoried a lot of my yard. Even stuff that I've bought that I thought was native, but it turned out to be from another area, like the sunflowers. So I don't know if everybody knows. I mean, I know there are different apps out there, but that's one that's come in handy for me.
Yes, I have heard of that Seek app, and that does work great. There are a lot of other, I meant to mention this earlier, so I'm glad that you mentioned that. There's another, it's called BONAP, BONAP, and it is a great resource. You can go in there and you can search the particular species you're wanting to find, and you can search it by state, and it will tell you whether or not that species is native or naturalized or not native, invasive. It'll give you a lot of information. I use that one quite frequently, but those are both really great resources to use.
And thank you for that suggestion. I hadn't heard of that one.
Yes, just to make sure that we're getting those native species, because yeah, we run into that problem all the time. These wildflower mixes online, you know, they do have some natives, but not all of them, and then you start to get issues when common names are used. So yeah, definitely both of those are great resources. All right. Well, if there are not any other questions, I will go ahead and stop this recording.